Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to our JRM Family Altar. It is my privilege to speak to you tonight about the topic, Faith in Practice. Our text can be found in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. I will be reading from the New King James Version where it says, For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. But before we delve deeper into this text, it is important to note sino nagsasalita ng mga katagang ito, kanino ito sinasabi, at sa anong kalagayan binitawan ang mga mensaheng ito. These are actually words from the Apostle Paul as a letter of encouragement to Timothy. Probably some of us are familiar with these texts from the many preachings that we have heard, that these are words from Paul when he was still in prison. But also probably some of us are not familiar that when this letter was received by Timothy, this was one of the most difficult and trying moments of his life while serving God and following God's purposes for his life. So these are two sides of the coin that we need to consider. To hear these words of encouragement from somebody during our darkest and most difficult and trying moments would be nice. But nothing is more encouraging and humbling and more grace-filled knowing that these words were spoken when Paul was not in a more comfortable position than Timothy. It is encouraging to know that these words were spoken when Paul was not in a safer place than anyone in the mission field, knowing that Paul was in prison and Timothy and the rest of the other believers are free. It's encouraging to know that these words were spoken when Paul was not in a more encouraging moment than Timothy. Nevertheless, Paul wrote a letter of encouragement and fortitude relentlessly. Nothing has stopped him, without hesitations and without reservations. On the side of Timothy, it has been 4 years since he started serving in the church in Ephesus without the physical guidance of Paul because Paul was in prison. And probably only one of the difficulties that Timothy was facing because during these times, all the other believers have had difficulties locating Paul. This is as a result of the persecution that Paul had experienced. That is why this letter, the 2 Timothy, was the first after 4 years. This is on top of all the other concerns that Timothy had or may have had been dealing with during these times, be it personal, family, or ministry. So one can only imagine kung ano yung pinagdadaanan ni Timothy during these times. As it was also mentioned by Paul in verse 4, that he was thinking of how he remembers the tears of Timothy even while serving and following God's purposes for his life. But Paul started the letter by telling Timothy of how his genuine faith has been proven all the way back from his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. We have to realize that this is Paul's call for Timothy to stir up what God has already given him. It's actually an internal check of what we already have. It's an internal check of what Paul has or what Timothy has in his heart. We have to remember that the internal stability will weather the external uncertainties. This is Paul's call also for Timothy to keep on going and how to keep on going. Much like Timothy, some of us at one point or another might be facing the most difficult and most fearful times that sometimes clouds our perspective of life and how it should be lived. And our tendencies are to draw back and isolate, to stagnate, or to leave everything behind because we come to the realization that following the purposes of God in our lives may be more complicated than we expected it to be. but the grace and mercy and the peace that God brings are always overflowing. We come to the realization that following the purposes of God in our lives demands us to count the cost of following Christ over and over again. And Paul, having witnessed and having proven the faith of Timothy, reminded Timothy again of what he was given. Paul is actually setting us an example that we can be a vessel of God's truth to some or many of our brothers and sisters, that while even in the midst of our own moments, trying moments, we can serve as God's vessel of truth, so that we can become a lamp to others' feet and a light to others' path. And this is what Paul has become to Timothy during these times. Paul is reminding us that wherever we are right now, no matter how chaotic and disheartening our situations may be, we can take these as opportunities to speak to ourselves or to others who may be in need of hearing these truths. Just as Paul spoke to Timothy, God has given you the spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. Just like Paul, when in fearful times, while he himself is in need of hearing these words, Paul took the opportunity to speak in love. This power comes from knowing that he was chosen by the will of God, as mentioned in verse 1 of the same chapter. And because of that, we can learn that we can trust God, because God will keep us even in the midst of difficult times, because it is His will and not ours. Paul also took this opportunity to speak in love. This spirit of love springs from the understanding that the purposes of God in our life is to tell others of the life God has promised. And because of that, we can learn that we can live in and by faith, because it was God who promised. Thirdly, Paul took the opportunity to speak in sound mind. The word sound mind comes from the Latin phrase which means able to think clearly and be in control of and responsible for your actions. The spirit of sound mind comes from the confidence in God who equips and sustains. So we can learn that in the midst of this, in the midst of the difficulties, we can also learn to strengthen others. This truth has to be reminded to us that even in our most fearful moments, God has given us the spirit of power, of love, and of a sound mind. From Paul's reminder and example, we can conclude that the difficult, fearful, and trying moments are actual moments of testing our response to opportunities. And what are these opportunities? 1. Opportunity to trust God. 2. Opportunity to be faithful to God. 3. Opportunity to strengthen others. I hope that we have learned something from tonight's sharing.